Hi. In this video, we're going to talk about the polis and what that means because it is a very key feature of the ancient Greek world moving forward. Okay, so with this lecture, we begin the period of ancient Greek history known as the Archaic period. And the dates on the Archaic period are fluid. All of these periods have pretty fluid dates because it's scholars today putting the dates on these eras, and we all argue over it. So we'll say sometime around 750 BC, because that's about where we left off with early Iron Age too. And then I'll say till 480 BC. Sounds pretty good. It's not just picked out of thin air. That represents essentially the end of the Persian War, which we'll learn about soon. And so that's a pretty major event and makes a pretty big divide in Greek history. So the sort of feature that really defines the transition from early Iron Age 2 into archaic Greece is a socio-political development. And this is specifically the development of a political entity in Greece known as the polis. Okay, so this is our word polis. People tend to translate it as city-state. You can use either term. I'll probably say polis much more often. And I'll also note right now, the plural of polis in Greek is polis, right? The E in there, so you'll see that as well when I'm pluralizing it. So what is this? Well, it is a political structure that emerges throughout the Greek world. Our technical working definition for this course is, it is a geographical area that includes both the city, right, a major city, or at least a capital city, and its territory. And this territory, mind you, can include towns and villages, right, for farmers and people like that. And these together make up a single, right? So this is just one little government, one little state, and they're also self-governing political unit. Okay? So we're going to see that the Greek world will now become divided into these polis or city-states. And so it is a town, a large town or city, and the area around it that it controls. And again, that area can include its own villages and towns as well. And they are independent and autonomous. So they are not connected to any other polis really in any political way. And they run themselves. They build their own government. They control themselves. So there are certainly similarities to the palace structure in the Minoan and the Mycenaean period, with the palace running a territory and controlling that region and any little towns or villages in it. It's a growth out of that. So we'll note a couple things about the polis. One is that a lot of these towns, a lot of these major cities that are the heartland of each polis are already there. They're usually a local regional authority. If we think back to our sort of Homeric society discussion, we said that probably in this early Iron Age 2 period, we see the emergence of like chieftains and high chiefs like the basileus. So probably where the basileus or where some local powerful chieftains rule that town or city, those are going to grow into capital cities by and large. Not a lot of new capitals are being built. And so most of these areas already had a government in place. And we said that government was usually a chieftain or basileus, a council of elders representing the major families. And then there's usually just like the rest of the citizens who might be called to assembly for different reasons. And so those kinds of structures are in place, and the polis is going to take those and adapt them for its own use. Now, the beginning of any polis, right, the start of any polis, is a process which we can call unification. Its technical term is synoikism. Right? So synoikism refers to the unification of an area into one polis. Right? So in other words, all of the kind of towns and villages in one area have to agree, okay, we're going to become one polis, and here our capital is going to be this major spot here, and we're all going to identify with it. We're going to consider ourselves citizens of this place. for the most part, this is a simple process. I will say right now, Greece has, we know of over 1,000 polis from the ancient Greek world. And for most of these, they're pretty small scale. In fact, often it's just a town and the plain that's around them that the people there are farming. And so for most people, this is a very simple process. You just agree, okay, we're our own unit, our own polis. But there's also certainly some bigger places, some bigger polis. And the process is always much more complex there because you're dealing with lots more people that have to agree to this creation, to the creation of this kind of political unit and to their identity with it. And so sometimes I'll say sometimes it doesn't really quite work out. Argos is an example here. Argos is a city that's on the what's called the Argive Plain in the Peloponnese. It's very close, in fact, to Mycenae. And it frequently attempts to assert its control over that plain and all the people who live there, and he frequently fails, right? The people there don't necessarily want to be under the rule of Argos, and so they resist it, and so it does not get to form such a strong polis. And for this reason, Argos is fairly important in the early Archaic period, and then you don't really hear about it much after that, right? It kind of drops off the radar. By and large, it fights with Sparta a bit, but it never can assert itself as a major power, and one reason is because it doesn't really coalesce in the same way that some other places do. Another thing is that you may need to use kind of social systems to create this unity, and one of those is religion. So if you have a sort of common religious cult that everyone in this geographical area shares, you all gather together to worship, this can be an instrument of cohesion, right? You can use this to make that kind of unification and synoikism happen. And so one thing you will see is like it'll have a temple that gets built in the city center and then shrines throughout the countryside, and there will be rites where you visit these, right? You go from one to the other, and it symbolizes that unity. And there are also a lot of stories of the unification process being placed back in sort of myth and legend, that a great hero of the area is responsible for it. This is true certainly of Athens, where they supposedly, the hero Theseus is the one who brought everyone together, and so in that way it's kind of enshrined in tradition, right? And so this is their history, and it's very important to them, so everyone agrees to this unification. All right, so like I said, probably over 1,000 of these polis in the ancient Greek world, but there are occasionally some slightly different political structures at play. And one other that you might see is the ethnos. An ethnos is a territory that does not have a capital, doesn't have a central government, or a formal sort of political union between the people living in that area. Every town there is autonomous, they're on their own, but they do have some kind of common identity. They do have some sense that they are related, that they are closely related, or that they share, again, like a religious cult. They all worship a similar god or goddess in a similar way. And they usually have a way to take united action when they need to. Like if they're being invaded, they will find a way to come together and to defend themselves. And so a big example of the ethnos structure is the region of Thessaly in northern Greece, right? They don't really form a city-state. They have this ethnos in that region. Okay, so those are our two main models, but by and large, the polis is the most common thing that we are going to see throughout the Archaic and Classical Greek periods, right? Everything is structured politically in the Greek world as a city-state or polis. Now, what does the government of a polis look like? So in the early Iron Age, we had a chieftain and a council of elders. They do not continue to do that. They make some changes. The basileus is largely abandoned, and in its place, we see the development of aristocracies. So the governments are now being run not just by one man, but by a group of elite families. Now, how do those people get power? What makes them elite? They are landowners. They're the people who, in this transition from like livestock to farming, they had large amounts of land that they could convert to crop raising and rent out to the poor who need land. And so they have a lot of wealth that comes to them, and that wealth translates into power within their polis. So these wealthy families seem to eliminate the basileus position, right? And the reason for this is probably just that there's only one basileus, but if you have an aristocracy, a lot of people can hold power at the same time. And so it's a way to share that power so they're not resenting, the one person who does get the power. And so the basileus is sometimes eliminated. Sometimes the power is just reduced. He becomes like a minor magistrate. and the rest of his functions are distributed amongst other officials. So we see, for instance, like in the city of Athens in the Archaic period, they had a guy named Basileus. He was a religious official in the city. He was just one of many. Okay, so we replace the Basileus with multiple magistrates, public officials. That's kind of our first thing. So we take the power of the Basileus and we spread it out amongst a bunch of people. And these people are what we call the magistrates or public officials. Only the aristocratic families could hold these positions. And so sometimes if a polis is smaller, and in earlier periods, what you just have is you have a board of magistrates who are appointed to run the city, and they figure out, who needs to do what. But in larger cities, these may be specialized. In other words, you may have to pick one magistrate who oversees the army, one magistrate who oversees the creation of the law code, one magistrate who oversees the finances of the city. They might be specialized in these bigger cities. It's also really common to have a chief magistrate, the one who is more in charge than the rest, right? Because sometimes you need a leader who's going to organize everyone else. And so we see this in a number of cities where they have many magistrates that they're all specialized, and then one is the chief amongst them. We see this in Athens, for instance, and in Corinth, and so on and so forth. Now, along with the magistrates that exist, we find the Council of Elders persists. Right? And this is known in Greek as the boule, B-O-U-L-E. And what happens in this period is that this Council of Elders, it continues really to be members of the elite families of the polis in this case. Sometimes the rule is that people who have served as magistrates are fed into the council, right? They enter it, and then they stay there for the rest of their lives. And the Council of Elders also often has a lot of power. Depending on the city-state, it will differ, but a lot of these councils are in charge of making policies and laws for the polis. Since the only people who can become magistrates are aristocrats, and the only people who can enter this council are magistrates, that means this council is full of aristocrats, right? And so aristocrats monopolize power in the Greek city-states. A small group of wealthy families holds all of the political power in these city-states. Now, there also exists a popular assembly. I'm running out of room here. And the popular assembly is essentially an assembly of the citizens, and this would refer to the adult free men of the polis who live there in that polis territory. This is known as the ecclesia, E-C-C-L-E-S-I-A. You'll sometimes see it spelled with K's, though. They generally have very little power. Sometimes they ratify the policies proposed by the boule, but even if that's so, their power seems to be limited. For instance, the very poor often don't have the right to join this assembly. Like if you don't own your own land, if you just have to rent it, you're usually excluded. They aren't allowed to propose any changes or anything of their own. So their power is incredibly limited. It's just to sort of agree to what these people have decided, right? The aristocrats have decided. So this is the nature of the aristocracy in the archaic polis, right? We will not see a lot of different types of governments, I'll say. You might think, when you think about the ancient Greek world, a lot of people think about Athenian democracy. Democracy occurs in just a few city-states, and it does not exist yet. It doesn't really exist until about 500 BC. And so these city-states are almost entirely uniformly aristocracies. And the nature of it may change from place to place, right? Which magistrates you have and so forth, the precise powers of the council versus the magistrates. But the aristocracy is the prevailing form of government. Okay, thank you guys for watching. Bye.